If you can't even carry your tray, maybe you should just order delivery, old man. The sharp voice cut through the hum of Jackson's Café on a Sunday morning, silencing the clatter of silverware and casual chatter for a moment. A group of young men in football jerseys let out careless bursts of laughter. No one stopped them. A server glanced over briefly, then quickly turned away as if nothing had happened. Only one man, elderly, slightly hunched, hands trembling as he held a tray with rough, callous fingers, kept walking. Staff Sergeant Joe Rickman, 76 years old, a former Marine, now moved with slow, deliberate steps, leaning on a weathered wooden cane. His tray wobbled slightly with each motion. No reply, no glare of resentment, just silence and strength. Why does that silence unsettle us more than a confrontational stare? Perhaps because it speaks of dignity, a kind of quiet resolve that mockery can never touch. We can pretend not to see. We can walk past as if the moment has nothing to do with us. But in a society that claims to honor those who served, standing idle in the face of such humiliation is no longer neutrality, it's complicity. In that moment, the cafe wasn't just a place to get breakfast. It became a mirror, reflecting the character of everyone inside. And while most kept their heads down, only one person stood up. Not with words, but with action. Joe Rickman always arrived at Jackson's Café at exactly 8:45 a.m. every Sunday, as regular as the sound of church bells drifting in from the end of the street. No one really knew why he chose that hour, or why he always sat alone at the corner table by the east-facing window, where the morning sun streamed through thick glass and gently lit his silver hair and deeply lined face. But one thing everyone knew: he never let anyone carry his tray. At 76, Staff Sergeant Joe Rickman was a small-framed man with narrow shoulders, but his back remained straight. The old wooden cane he relied on with every step wasn't just to support it, was a symbol of his will. He had served as a Marine at Café, Vietnam, a name many young people had never even heard. An explosion had shattered his spine and left him hospitalized for nearly a year. Doctors once told him he'd never walk again. But for Joe, recovery wasn't just physical, it was a duty. To the comrades who never made it home, and to the honor he had sworn to protect. Every Sunday, he carried his tray. Black coffee, soft-boiled eggs, and dry toast, no help needed. It wasn't a habit, it was the principle. Because for him, independence wasn't something you surrendered to. It was something a soldier preserved to the very end, even when hands began to tremble and each step grew slower. Some people enter a room and don't need to speak a word. Their presence alone quiets the noise. Joe Rickman was one of them. No one knew the full story of what he'd endured, but everyone felt he deserved respect. Not because he demanded it, but because he lived in a way that made it feel inevitable. In a small corner of a fast-moving modern America, there were still those who quietly upheld the values of honor and resilience, reminding us that some things should never be forgotten. 3 men sat near the counter, wearing fishing league jerseys with Midwest tournament logos. Despite it being barely past 9 a.m., they each held a beer in hand. Their laughter echoed freely, with no attempt to keep it down. "Look at that guy," one of them sneered, "probably faking the whole disabled act just to get a discount." Another one cackled. "Bet he needs 3 breaks just to make it 10 steps. You sure he even served?" Everyone heard it. The waitress pouring coffee froze mid-motion. Some diners looked down at their plates, suddenly more fascinated with their pancakes than the man shuffling by. No one said a word. No one did a thing. But Joe Rickman kept walking. Slowly. The tray in his hands shook slightly. He didn't turn around, didn't react. But he also didn't stop. Because to him, silence wasn't submission, it was the armor of someone who had survived explosions and carried humanity through the heart of war. He dropped a fork as he neared his usual table. The clatter of metal on tile rang out like a muted call for help. No one wanted to answer. One of the mockers muttered, "I'd help, but I don't do Marine cosplay." Laughter again, sharper this time, crueler. This wasn't just an insult to a veteran. It was a slap in the face to everything this country once claimed to value: honor, courage, sacrifice, all dismissed like some cheap joke. And perhaps even more painful was the silent complicity of those who witnessed it. Not everyone is cruel, but too many are silent. And sometimes, that silence is more frightening than the insults themselves because it allows wrongness to continue, unchallenged, unchecked, and uncorrected. It allows us to forget that the values we hold dear should never be taken lightly. He stood up without a word of warning. No slamming fists, no shouting, no arguments against the cruel remarks that had just echoed through the cafe. Just one motion, slow but deliberate, that made the entire room hold its breath. The man in a crisp military uniform walked towards Staff Sergeant Joe Rickman's table. On his shoulder was a silver eagle, the insignia of a Marine colonel. He didn't look at the men who had mocked. He didn't search the room for support. Instead, he bent down and picked up the fork Joe had dropped while struggling to hold his tray with trembling hands. Then he gently placed it on the table, stepped back, and stood at attention. Not beside Rickman, but directly behind him. Back straight, hands at his sides, heels together. The posture of a soldier performing the most sacred duty of his life. A silent act of absolute respect. He said nothing, but in that silence, the room heard everything. This man deserves to be honored, and I will not let him stand alone. That presence wordless snuffed out the laughter. It was stronger than any speech, because some values, when shown through action, echo far longer than any words ever could. Sometimes, to protect someone, you don't need to speak. You just need to stand, steady, and close enough for them to know they are not alone. The air inside the cafe remained heavy after that moment of silence. Eyes darted, spoons paused mid-air. And then, the colonel, still standing behind Joe Rickman, slowly reached into his chest pocket and pulled out a small item. It was an old photograph, faded with time, carefully laminated. He held it up for all to see. The image showed a moment from war. A young soldier face smeared with mud, uniform torn, carrying a wounded comrade on his back through the jungles of Vietnam. Though the photo had dulled with age, one thing was clear: the fierce determination in his eyes, Joe Rickman's eyes. Colonel Conley lowered the photo, his gaze locking onto the group who had laughed. His voice was calm, but every word landed like a strike. This man carried me out of a burning Humvee outside Hue in 1971, 3 miles through enemy territory with a bullet in his leg. He's the reason I'm alive, the reason I have a family, the reason I wear these stars on my shoulder. The truth, revealed quietly, hit like a silent thunderclap. Behind the slow gate was the past of a hero. And perhaps the cruelest part wasn't the mocking, but the fact that no one thought to ask. Sometimes, just listening before judging is all it takes to prevent real harm. After the truth came to light, the room fell into a different kind of silence. Not awkward, but reverent. Eyes filled with disbelief now turned to the man who had been ridiculed just minutes earlier, now seen through a lens of long overdue respect. The cafe owner, Mr. Jackson, stepped out from behind the counter, his face solemn. "Sergeant Rickman," he said, "with your permission, I'd like to name this table after you." The veteran lifted his head. His eyes didn't show surprise, only calm acceptance, as if his soul had long since learned to meet the world with the patience of someone who had stood amid fire and survived. "No need," he replied. But Jackson gently insisted. "Yes, some things must be remembered." The whole cafe then turned their eyes toward the men in the fishing jerseys, now silent, stripped of swagger. One of them stepped forward, his voice low. "Sir, I owe you an apology." Joe didn't respond immediately. He looked the man in the eyes, no anger, no sarcasm, just the gaze of someone who had long grown used to being misunderstood and still chose forgiveness. No handshake, no dramatic proclamation of pardon, just a single nod, enough to let the man know his words had been heard. In a world too quick to judge and too hurried to understand, sometimes an apology can't erase the past, but it can open the door to healing if one is brave enough to step through. A week later, just as he had done every Sunday for over a decade, Staff Sergeant Joe Rickman returned to Jackson's Café. But this time, something was different. Above his usual table, a small bronze plaque gleamed against the wall, reserved for Staff Sergeant Joe Rickman, still standing. Beneath it, a framed photo, the very same image Colonel Conley had held up, showed the young soldier carrying his wounded brother through a forest aflame with war. His eyes, filled with purpose, now stood as a living symbol of quiet heroism. Joe said nothing when he saw it. He simply laid a hand on the wooden tabletop, as if feeling something deeper than the engraved words. At a nearby table, the same men who once mocked him were present. They stood as he entered, not loudly, not for show, but with the quiet respect that America still holds for those who served. No flowers, No ceremony. Just a chair that was always ready, a small plaque, and a cafe full of people who silently nodded as he walked past. And so, a new tradition began. Not because someone ordered it, but because a community finally recognized that some heroes don't need to be celebrated, they just need to be remembered. True honor isn't in the volume of applause. It's in the quiet persistence of gratitude. And sometimes, it's the silence that echoes longest. In a world growing louder by the day, where old values seem to fade, the story of Staff Sergeant Joe Rickman reminds us, courage doesn't always shout. And greatness often lives in a slow gait, a steady gaze, or a small plaque in the corner of a familiar cafe. Some people never tell their stories. They don't ask for respect, because how they live commands it. And in time, the world will quiet itself enough to finally hear them. Don't judge a slow step or a trembling hand. They may have walked through places you can't imagine, carrying memories you couldn't bear. Learn to see with respect, because there are people whose mere presence can make a room stand at attention. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of a grandfather, a father, or someone who served in quiet strength, leave a comment below. I stand with them. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, subscribe and hit the notification bell. There are still countless silent heroes waiting for their names to be heard. They deserve it. And you can be the one to help them be remembered.